Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country in West Africa, is facing one of the most severe food crises in its modern history. To the international community, the country often appears on the list of the poorest and most aid-dependent nations. But behind the cold statistics and impersonal reports are painful stories of millions struggling each day for a single decent meal. More than 3.4 million people in Burkina Faso currently live in critical food insecurity. That means they do not know where their next meal will come from, if it comes at all. Among them are hundreds of thousands of children suffering from acute malnutrition. Images of emaciated children with sunken eyes and wrinkled skin are no longer shocking headlines. They are the daily reality in many villages across the country. The root causes of Burkina Faso's food crisis are complex. First, there is nature's growing hostility. The country lies in the Sahel rayon, a land already arid and now pushed further into dryness by climate change. Rainy seasons have become erratic. Droughts are longer. The soil is exhausted. Millions of farmers can no longer rely on their land. Entire families that once grew millet, rice, or maize are abandoning their fields, migrating to the cities in search of anything, any job, any hope of survival. But migration is not a guaranteed escape. Major cities like Ouagadougou and Bob Doulasso are already overburdened and now struggle to absorb the growing influx of internal climate refugees. These families live cramped in makeshift shelters without clean water, electricity, toilets, or regular food. Children drop out of school. Adults find no jobs or are exploited in menial labor. Hunger haunts them not only in their stomachs, but in their eyes, in the dulling of their dreams. Worse still, hunger in Burkina Faso is not only caused by nature. Armed conflict is tearing through the northern and eastern parts of the country. Extremist groups, terrorists, and militias have driven hundreds of communities into exile. Villages lie abandoned. Roads are cut off. Aid cannot get through. In the isolated regions, food and medicine have disappeared. People are left with nothing except fear. In this bleak landscape, international aid has become the only lifeline for millions. Hundreds of tons of rice, flour, cooking oil, sugar, and powdered milk arrive from Europe, the US, and global agencies. Yet, ironically, despite all this help, the country remains trapped in poverty. Emergency aid may help people survive the day, but it cannot change their future. Worse still, long-term dependency on foreign aid has drained the motivation to build a resilient food system from within. The domestic agricultural sector has been neglected for years. It is fragmented, outdated, and underfunded. Farmers lack training, credit, equipment, or guaranteed buyers. Rather than investing in local production, the government has often turned again and again to outside donors, reinforcing a cycle of helplessness. Aid has become a magic stick, but also a golden shackle stifling the drive for self-reliance. Hunger does not only affect the body, it crushes the spirit. Depression, domestic violence, and crime rise with the hopelessness. Many young people seeing no future join armed groups not out of ideology, but for a chance to eat and send money home. Burkina Faso risks losing an entire generation, not just to starvation but to despair. The crisis undermines not only individuals but the very foundation of the nation state. A population on the brink of famine is easier to manipulate. Foreign actors, particularly multinational corporations in mining and energy, use humanitarian aid as a tool for influence. In exchange for food, some leaders have signed away access to valuable resources. National sovereignty erodes silently, meal by meal. This grim reality calls for a reawakening. No nation can survive on aid forever. No people can take pride in themselves if every day begins with an open hand. Burkina Faso's food crisis is the result of years of mismanagement, war, and neglect. But it is also an opportunity and inflection point. It is a chance to rethink everything. How food is grown, who owns the land, and what kind of future the country deserves. This is not just a question of hunger. It is a question of dignity. The time has come to teach people not only how to eat, but how to feed themselves. The dream of a self-sufficient Burkina Faso where food grows from local hands and nourishes local children must no longer be a dream. It must become a national goal, because every empty stomach is not just a humanitarian tragedy, is a call for justice. President Ibrahim Traoré never viewed hunger as a mere natural disaster. To him, it wasn't just their result of drought or war, but a deeper outcome consequence of a global system designed to keep Africa dependent. He often told his cabinet, "Natural disasters are temporary, but dependence is permanent, and that's what's killing our nation." For decades, Burkina Faso, many African nations had become a consumer of imported food, while local farmers were pushed out of the market by multinational corporations. Rice, wheat flour, milk, and cooking oil were largely imported from Europe, heavily subsidized and sold at price cheaper than local products. As a result, farmers lost motivation to grow, fields were abandoned, and the domestic food supply chain was systematically dismantled. In a closed-door meeting with economic advisors, President Traoré made it clear, when a country can't feed itself, it is no longer a sovereign nation. We are trapped in the golden cage of humanitarian aid, and we must break out of it. He began by reviewing the entire structure of the national food system. Where were the seeds coming from? Who owned the storage facilities? Where was the aid money going? These weren't just technical questions. They were the key to uncovering the injustice quietly unfolding. He discovered that much of the food aid was controlled by international organizations dependent on Western funding. These aid packages often came with strings attached. Open markets to foreign companies or committo economic policies favorable to donors. Worse still, this aid displaced local support for farmers because the competition wasn't fair. "This is the vicious cycle of modern colonialism," he declared in a speech to the public. "They give us rice but take away our seeds. They give us wheat but destroy our maize. They give us fish but forbid us to hold the net." In Traoré's vision, the problem wasn't food quantity, it was control. Who owned the supply chain? Who decided what farmers could grow, what they could sell, and at what price? Therefore, he didn't merely call for humanitarian support. He called for the liberation of agriculture from foreign control, and he viewed food sovereignty not as a policy, but as a revolution. On trips to rural areas, he personally met with farmers, listened to their voices, and came to an important realization. The people didn't need handouts. They needed opportunity. An old farmer in Cayo once told him, "We don't need American rice. We need water to grow millet, good seeds to plant, and fair markets to sell our crops." Traoré nodded. That was the truth. From that moment, he ordered the establishment of local food cooperatives, launched a program to protect farmland from speculation, and implemented direct financial support to farmers, rather than relying on international aid. At the same time, he called on the world to change its perception of Africa. "We are not the continent of poverty," he said at an international forum. "We are victims of a system programmed to keep us from ever standing on our own." He especially criticized unfair trade terms, where Burkina Faso exports raw cotton at low prices and imports shirts at 10 times the cost, or where African farmers' coffee is bought for pennies and sold back from Europe as premium coffee. To Traoré, economic justice was not a slogan. It was essential to his country's survival, and he knew that to achieve it, he had to change mindsets, structures, and above all restore the people's belief that they could stand on their own. He often told the youth, "We are not poor because we lack resources. We are poor because we don't control what we own." President Ibrahim Traoré knew that breaking the vicious cycle of poverty and hunger required more than words. It called for bold, decisive action that defied the norms of past governments. And so he did the unthinkable. He announced the nationalization of all abandoned agricultural lands and launched a large-scale campaign called Feed Ourselves. In a nationally televised address before the transitional parliament, he declared, "We have millions of hectares of abandoned land, while our people die of hunger. This is unacceptable. As of today, any land previously granted but left unused will be reclaimed for food production. This is not confiscation. This is the restoration of national sovereignty." His announcement sent shockwaves through the old elite. To those who had hoarded land for speculation, villas, or to sell off to foreign corporations. But to millions of farmers and poor rural communities, it was a beacon of hope. The government established a special task force under the supervision of the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Defense to survey and recover hundreds of thousands of hectares of idle land. Some of it was handed to local cooperatives, while the rest became part of strategic agricultural zones areas where the state invested in infrastructure, provided seeds, fertilizers, training, and guaranteed product purchases. The Feed Ourselves campaign was more than a slogan. It was a comprehensive plan built on several key pillars. 1. Developing indigenous crops. The government refused to import genetically modified seeds. Instead, it invested in national agricultural research institutes to restore and enhance traditional crops like millet, maize, and kava varieties better adapted to Burkina Faso's harsh climate. 2. Training a new generation of farmers. Thousands of unemployed youth were enrolled in modern agriculture programs, learning about drip irrigation, organic composting, and sustainable farming. Traoré called them warriors of the land. 3. Building local storage and distribution systems. The government invested in public grain storage in each region to prevent post-harvest loss and reduce dependency on global supply chains. 4. Changing the mindset through media. On national television, radio, and social media, the government launched a media campaign with a powerful message. To grow food is patriotic. To feed yourself is freedom. During a field inspection in the Sahel, President Traoré personally encouraged farmers sowing seeds in newly reclaimed fields. He did not arrive with a flashy convoy. Dressed in work clothes, barefoot, and holding a shovel, he stood alongside the people. The image quickly went viral with the caption, "A leader who doesn't just talk, acts." The campaign's impact became evident in just 6 months. Cultivated land doubled. Food prices dropped significantly. Many families who once depended on aid now sold. Vegetables at local markets. Rural schools began receiving lunches sourced from community-grown produce. An elderly woman in Tugan told a reporter, "We used to wait for us from foreign aid. Now I cook with millet, beans, and vegetables that I grow myself. It's a pride I never knew." Not everyone was pleased. Some former officials and businessmen whose lands were reclaimed protested loudly. International organizations expressed concerns about private property rights. But Traoré stood firm. At a global press conference, he responded, "When my people are hungry, land cannot be left to rot for the benefit of a few. We are not taking from anyone. We are reclaiming what rightfully belongs to the people." That quote was printed on thousands of posters across the country. Land for the people, not for profit. Alongside agricultural reform, Traoré expanded the local food market system, where affordable produce from cooperatives was sold directly to consumers. The government applied a fair trade model to eliminate intermediaries, ensuring higher profits for farmers and lower prices for families. The results: hunger rates dropped by 20% within a year. Burkina Faso, a symbol of famine, was recognized by the African Union as a leader in reclaiming food sovereignty. President Traoré understood that the fight against hunger wasn't just about filling stomach, it's restoring the dignity of a nation. When someone can grow their own food and feed their family from their own soil, they don't just survive, they live with pride. President Ibrahim Traoré understood that a nation cannot rise without placing its youth at the heart of its development. After announcing the nationalization of abandoned lands and launching the Feed Ourselves campaign, he shifted his focus to the core force of the country, the youth of Burkina Faso. In a nationally broadcast speech, he declared, "Youth are not just the future, they are the present. It is you who will perform miracles from our dry soil. If our ancestors could build from nothing with bare hands, we can do even more today with knowledge and technology." Unlike empty slogans, this call came with concrete actions. The government swiftly established a national program called Youth Reclaiming the Motherland. The goal was to mobilize tens of thousands of young people to engage in agriculture, rehabilitate farmlands, and develop smart farming models. Agricultural training centers previously neglected were refurbished, equipped. Young people received training in modern farming techniques, water-saving irrigation systems, drone-assisted crop monitoring, and crucially sustainable and eco-friendly practices. Issa, a young man who had studied engineering but had been unemployed, 4 years shared his experience. "I never imagined I'd become a farmer, but now manage a smart irrigation system for a 10-hectare field in Kaya. We're growing not only food crops, but also medicinal plants for export. Youth participation extended beyond farming. They formed agricultural startups focusing on food processing, storage, and distribution. A mobile app called Youth Market, developed by a group of young engineers, enabled farmers to sell their produce directly to consumers, cutting out middlemen and boosting profits. To support youth entrepreneurship in agriculture, the National Bank launched a Youth Agricultural Development Fund with low-interest loans. Projects that were innovative, technology-driven, and promised community job creation received priority approval. The results became visible within a year. Youth unemployment dropped significantly. Many previously abandoned lands were transformed into lush fields. Domestic food production rose, reducing dependence on foreign aid. Most importantly, the exodus of rural youth to cities or ABRO due to hunger drastically declined. Another major impact was a shift in how agriculture was perceived among youth. Farming, once considered a last resort, became a respectable and promising profession. President Traoré regularly visited youth-run farms, listened to their feedback, and even joined them in the fields. These visits were recorded and broadcasted to inspire the public. He made no secret of his dream that one day Burkina Faso would export agricultural technology across the Sahel region. Initially, international organizations were skeptical of the campaign's viability. But after witnessing thousands of hectares of restored land and engaged youth communities, perspectives began to shift. A FAO report stated the model of youth mobilization combined with technology and land rehabilitation in Burkina Faso could serve as a reference for many developing countries. During a regional summit, Traoré declared, "They once called us the jobless generation, the lost generation, but now I see youth turning deserts into gardens, dreams into reality." That is the strongest form of resistance against the so-called destiny of poverty they imposed on us. The slogan, "We are the generation that sows," began spreading on social media, t-shirts, murals, and even textbooks. The movement's spirit transcended Burkina Faso's borders in Mali, Niger. Senegal youth organizations started adopting similar models. What began as a hunger relief campaign had evolved into a social revival movement, one in which young people not only saved the nation from hunger, but also redefined their role in society from being seen as burdens to becoming symbols of hope. And it all started with a simple, powerful quote from Ibrahim Traoré: "The land never betrays those who sow." When the Feed Ourselves campaign officially launched, President Ibrahim Traoré understood that defeating hunger in Burkina Faso couldn't rely on slogans or enthusiasm alone. It required a long-term strategy tailored to the country's harsh climate and unique realities. Thus, he directed the government's focus toward building an independent agricultural system grounded in three key pillars: strategic grain reserves, expansive irrigation infrastructure, and climate-resilient native crops. The first priority was storage. In the past, Burkina Faso had often experienced abundant harvests that went to waste due to poor preservation capabilities. Grains spoiled from humidity, insects, or were lost during transport. Traoré urgently ordered the construction of a nationwide network of strategic grain reserves located across key rural zones. These facilities were built to modern standards, equipped with temperature and humidity controls and tight security. He also tasked local engineers and foreign experts with improving traditional storage techniques, using modern technologies while preserving indigenous knowledge. Next came irrigation, a life-or-death issue in a country facing persistent droughts due to climate change. Previously, farmers in Burkina Faso depended almost entirely on rainfall. A single year of poor rains meant widespread hunger. Traoré refused to accept this as fate. He directed the Ministry of Agriculture to build hundreds of mid-sized artificial reservoirs in arid areas and to restore old colonial-era canals that had long been abandoned. Additionally, wells, hand pumps, and solar-powered irrigation systems were introduced in remote villages. To ensure effective water management, Traoré created mobile agricultural engineering units composed of young engineers and volunteers to travel from village to village, installing drip irrigation systems and training farmers in water-saving techniques. This was more than just a material investment. It was a transformation in mindset. Africans deserve access to modern agricultural technologies just like anyone else. However, the core of his strategy lay in crop selection. Traoré famously stated, "We cannot rely on imported seeds from the West only to live in fear each planting season. We must return to the seeds of our ancestors." He established the National Center for Indigenous Seed Research and Preservation, dedicated to fostering, propagating, and enhancing traditional crops such as millet, sorghum, native maize, moringa, cowpeas, and groundnuts. These crops are not only drought-resistant, but also rich in nutritional value. Agricultural experts were mobilized to hybridize native varieties with modern techniques to ensure higher yields without losing their natural resilience. Importantly, Traoré banned genetically modified seeds tied to foreign patent monopolies, a bold move asserting national food sovereignty. The government also expanded access to credit for farmers, allowing them to purchase organic fertilizer, plowing equipment, food processing machines, and crop insurance. Agricultural cooperatives were revived and expanded, serving as hubs for both production and training in improved methods. Traoré didn't stop at boosting raw production. He encouraged the development of a full domestic agricultural value chain, from harvesting to processing, packaging, and marketing. Small-scale processing plants began to appear across the countryside, generating jobs for women and youth. He declared, "A single grain of rice processed at home holds more value than exporting it raw and buying back processed food from abroad." Thanks to these coordinated and determined policies, Burkina Faso's agricultural sector began to transform. Farming was no longer seen as a fallback option, viewed as a strategic profession. Children started dreaming of becoming agricultural engineers instead of immigrating abroad. Traoré turned agriculture, once neglected, into a source of national pride. The future of Burkina Faso, he believed, would be rooted in its soil, cultivated with dignity, protected by knowledge, and sustained by the hands of its own people. Ibrahim Traoré stood before thousands of farmers in the Kaya region, one of the area's hardest hit by drought in Burkina Faso, on cracked earth under a pale sky. He declared, "We cannot wait for foreigners to feed us. Freedom begins when we control our own bowl of rice." This wasn't just a statement. It was a wake-up call, a resolute rejection of the dependency model that has ensnared African nations like Burkina Faso for decades. Since the colonial era, foreign aid has been considered a lifeline for poor nations, particularly in agriculture and food security. But Traoré understood a painful truth. Aid is never free, and long-term dependence only strips a country of its sovereignty. Over 60% of Burkina Faso's food once came from foreign aid, especially from Europe, the US, and multilateral organizations. Bags of flour, tins of oil, and boxes of rice labeled gift from were a common sight at relief distribution points. But while people grew dependent on food aid, local farmers were neglected, lands abandoned, and the domestic market crushed by cheap imported products. At times, local rice couldn't even be sold because it had to compete with free imported aid. Farmers became unemployed on their own fields. After launching the Feed Ourselves campaign and investing in an independent agricultural system, Traoré took the next step, ending the dependency mindset. He ordered a review of all foreign food aid programs, especially those tied to political strings. Any contract requiring Burkina Faso to compromise its internal policies was to be re-examined or cancelled. He stated, "We are not against aid, but aid must not be a chain. If a food package comes with silence in the face of injustice, we don't need it." That declaration unsettled many international organizations and Western governments, but to the people of Burkina Faso, it marked a profound shift in national consciousness. To bring the concept of food sovereignty to life, Traoré mandated that public schools, orphanages, and hospitals prioritize local produce in daily meals. Any institution still using imported rice would lose its government subsidies. From villages to cities, people began shifting their consumption habits. Locally grown rice, though less polished in appearance, was clean and safe, and slowly became a preferred choice. Indigenous vegetables and traditional legumes also returned to family tables. Traoré emphasized that feeding oneself was not just about economic Sit was a matter of dignity. People couldn't live on pity forever. Every bowl of rice harvested from their own soil was a symbol of self-respect. He recounted a story from his time as a young peacekeeping soldier in another African nation. Seeing people lined up for food from a foreign delegation, he'd wondered, why do we have land, people, sun, and rain, but still wait to be fed by others? Now, as president, he had the chance to answer that question through concrete action. Of course, his decision sparked controversy. Some argued that cutting food aid was unrealistic in a country still struggling with poverty. But Traoré didn't pursue an all-or-nothing approach. He proposed a clear roadmap. Years 1, 2, reduce foreign food aid by 30% while increasing domestic production through improved seeds and techniques. Years 3, 4, cease imports of rice and flour aid and construct strategic food storage facilities in each province. Year 5, achieve full self-sufficiency in staple foods, accepting aid only in cases of severe natural disasters and with full transparency. From Burkina Faso, the food sovereignty movement began to spread to neighboring countries like Mali, Niger, and Togo. Young leaders started asking, if Burkina Faso can do it, why can't we? In a televised interview, Traoré said, we have borrowed rice from others for too long. Now it's time to sow our own seeds. Only rice harvested by our own hands carries the taste of freedom. After President Ibrahim Traoré launched the Feed Ourselves campaign and implemented bold reforms for food sovereignty, the impact of his actions quickly spread beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. What initially seemed like an internal response to crisis became a powerful source of inspiration for the entire West African region, and soon extended across other parts of the African continent. In neighboring Mali, young farmers began reorganizing local agricultural cooperatives. They followed the model promoted by Traoré, focusing on indigenous crops, prioritizing traditional produce, and reducing reliance on imported goods. A group of youth in the Sioux region initiated a program called One Village, One Self-Sufficient Field. In the same spirit as Burkina Faso's example, sowing, cultivating, harvesting, and processing within the community without waiting for external intervention. At the same time, in Niger, often ranked among the world's poorest countries, local governments introduced policies mandating public institutions to consume only domestic produce. Widespread media campaigns, especially on radio, the most influential communication tool in rural areas, began to shift public perception. No longer were Thai or French rice seen as premium products. Instead, people began to take pride in millet, maize, and rice grown in their own soil. This movement was not just agricultural, it was an ideological revolution. In Guinea, schools began altering their lunch menus, switching from imported goods to traditional local dishes. Teachers educated students about native crops, the history of local food systems, and why it was vital to respect trees, yam, or beans grown in their homeland. In Senegal, agricultural universities hosted seminars titled Food Sovereignty, Lessons from Burkina Faso. Many students chose to write their graduation thesis on Traoré's food policies. Even in countries long dependent on aid like the Central African Republic or Togo, governments began to revisit the conditions tied to international agricultural trade agreements. They realized that accepting foreign rice or wheat was no longer a sustainable solution as each grain came with political strings attached. Rather than continuing a cycle of dependency, they started localizing seed systems, constructing food storage facilities, and organizing grassroots cooperatives driven by the people. Traoré didn't keep his initiatives confined to Burkina Faso. On the contrary, he freely shared his data, models, and experiences. He dispatched Burkinab engineers and agricultural experts to support neighboring countries. At a regional summit in Ouagadougou, he declared, "We cannot be independent alone. An African grain should grow on African land, be cultivated by African hands, and serve the future of African children." These words sparked discussions across the West African Economic and Monetary Union (UA). What was once dismissed as anti-globalist rhetoric now prompted serious questions. If a poor country like Burkina Faso could reduce food import dependency by 60% in just 2 years, what was stopping wealthier resource-rich nations across the Sahel? Informal networks of farmers began to form. They exchanged seeds, shared cultivation tips, and even advocated for a regional food sovereignty alliance. Images of President Traoré in a simple military uniform, hoe in hand, working in the rice fields, spread across social media. No longer just a strong-willed president, he became a symbol of inspiration teacher, reminding Africa that it could stand tall on its own feet. Ibrahim Traoré once said, "A grain of rice may be small, but when it is sown with freedom, it can grow into a future." Today, those grains are sprouting all over the continent, not in foreign aid bags stamped with foreign flags, but from the soil, sweat, and dreams of African people. No one could have predicted that a campaign born of desperation would become a beacon of hope for an entire continent.